Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're able to join us tonight. I want to thank Rabbi Robin Nafshi for all the work in helping to put this event together. I'm so glad that you're here, Robin, as well. The sponsors for tonight's discussion are Temple Beth Jacob, Beth Abraham, and Temple Israel of Portsmouth. I'm sorry, Beth Abraham of Nashua, and Temple Israel of Portsmouth. So we are all quite thrilled to see you all. So perhaps some of you came in right after I had said it would be so nice, even for just a moment, if we were all to open up our screens so that we can greet each other panim el panim, face to face, even if for just a second, if you're comfortable to do that. And then when you're ready to turn it off, feel free, to do that. My name is Rabbi Kaya Stern Kaufman, and I am the rabbi here at Temple Israel in Portsmouth. And here in this meeting with Rabbi John Spira Savet, the rabbi at Beth Abraham in Nashua, and of course, Rabbi Shai Held. Rabbi Shai Held is a philosopher and a theologian and a Bible scholar. He is the president and dean at the Hadar Institute, where he is also the host of Hadar's newest podcast called Answers with Held. Great pun. Rabbi Held received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America. Rabbi Held is the author of several books, including Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and most recently, and the subject of tonight's talk, his book, Judaism is About Love, which looks just like this. It's a beautiful purple color. I had some thoughts about maybe why you chose purple. And it's a wonderful book, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So tonight, we are going to talk a lot about love. At this precious moment in our personal lives and in the life of our people, we recognize with broken hearts that this moment, this week, the families of Hirsch Goldberg Pullen, Carmel Gatt, Ori Danino, Eden Yerushalmi, Alex Lobanov, Almog Sarusi, all of their families are sitting Shiva. We join with them tonight and dedicate our Torah, our teaching, and our learning to the elevation of their souls. Through our discussion tonight, may our awareness of love as our guiding force expand, and may we find some comfort in the wisdom of our ancient and contemporary sages. So I'd like to offer a prayer, and then we'll begin our conversation. This prayer is an El Malay, and it was written by Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld and shared widely just last week. El Malay Rachamim. God full of mercy, womb of the world, in whom there is room enough for all life to flourish, from whom there is blessing enough for all life to be nourished. We call out to you, brokenhearted, Shochein Bameramim, you who dwell on high, beyond the borders of loyalty and love that make us human, hearing what we cannot, holding what we cannot, healing what we cannot. Help us. Hamtsei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashechina. Grant perfect rest beneath the wings of your presence to the precious innocent souls, Israeli and Palestinian, Jewish and Muslim, Christian, Bedouin and Druze, migrant workers from around the world who have lost their lives to the ravages of war during this past year. Shelter those who witnessed unspeakable brutality and whose walls could not protect them. Carry those who were caught or cornered, unable to escape destruction, degradation, despair. Lift up those who searched for sustenance or safety, longing for the embrace of home. B'ma'alot kedoshim u'tehorim, kezohar harakia mazhirim. May those souls who are with you now be granted a glimpse of the world as you see it, shimmering everywhere with the light of your presence. Began Eden, Tehemenuchatam. May they find rest and comfort in your holy garden. Ana, Baal Harachamim, please, Master of Mercy. Yastirehem beseter kinafecha laolamim, bitzur hachaim et nishmotehem. Hide them beneath the cover of your wings forever, and let their souls be bound up with ours, summoning us all to righteousness and hope renewed. Adonai hu nachalatam, v'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavotam. May your unending love be their inheritance. May their eternal resting place be your peace. And let us say, Amen.
Amen.
So I'm going to turn now to Rabbi John to start us off with some conversation, questions, and thoughts with Rabbi Shai-Hel.
Thank you, Kaya, and Yishar Kochech. I feel like also what you just brought us together with is kind of, in a way, the purpose of our hour here, which is to pray and learn our way toward being the beings who could really pray and live that tefillah. And so while we're going to move, I guess, into the head a bit, it's really with this is a lot, of course, about the mind and the soul, and I guess that's the lead in, Shai, to the first question. It's obviously the question we worked out and is the setup just to get you to help us set some terms and some language we can share in this conversation, which is really, what do you mean when you're talking about love? And you talk in your book, and of course in your teaching for a long time, about love as including emotions that we identify as love, and being more than that, being a kind of orientation in the world. And would love to hear you talk about that more. And even if there are particular terms in our tradition that you are translating as love, to help us get oriented.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to all of you for being part of this tonight. I'm honored to be in this conversation with you. So maybe I would start by saying, I think it's important to clarify, when we talk about love in a spiritual or religious sense, we're not talking about love that equals an emotion. As I'll talk about in a moment, the kind of love I'm talking about, the kind of love I think the Jewish tradition talks about, has emotional dimensions to it, but is not simply equivalent to an emotion. Love is more like an orientation, to use a word you just invoked, John. I think love is a way of holding ourselves in the world. The term that I coined, that I find kind of embarrassing because it's so pretentious, but I find it really helpful in my own thinking, love is an existential posture. It's how we hold ourselves in the world. Or if you like the language of philosophy, you can say love is a disposition to feel certain things and act in certain ways. Now, if you have a disposition, but it never manifests in an emotion, then you're either going to lose the disposition, or in fact, you already have. It has emotional manifestations, but it itself is not an emotion. And why am I saying that? Because you can't build a spiritual life on a feeling. Because feelings, as we all know from our own experience, feelings come and go. If you built a spiritual life on a feeling, then you'd have a spiritual life one moment and not a spiritual life the next, right? Almost by definition, any feeling we have, the example that I often think about is, if you've ever had the experience of waking up and feeling really grateful for the gift of life, and then 10 minutes later, you find yourself ruining the day you were born and wondering why anything is there at all. You know that feelings kind of ebb and flow. So you can't build a spiritual life on a feeling. It's in fact a posture. And I wish I had said this more emphatically in the book, actually. I think we do people a lot of damage when we talk about how they're supposed to feel certain things all the time. And that's because I think most often one of two things happen when we do that. Either people begin to lie to themselves. Because wait a minute, if I'm supposed to be loving all the time, oh, well, then I never feel anything but love. And then what ends up happening is they cultivate a huge shadow self, parts of themselves that they're not aware of at all. You've all undoubtedly met someone who whose affect is, hey, I'm all about love. I love every living thing. And meanwhile, you see that right beneath the surface, they're like a simmering pot of rage, right? You've all met someone like that, undoubtedly. And I think that when we have this discourse of you should feel certain things, you should feel love all the time, we actually do people a lot of damage, and we undermine self-awareness. Or at the other extreme, we convince people to say, you know what, if that's what a spiritual life is, I'm out, because I'm not capable of that. Sometimes I just feel sad and lonely. I don't feel overwhelmed by love. So when I talk about love as a disposition and an orientation, I'm trying simultaneously to say something that is very daunting and very accessible, because what it does is allow people to feel what they feel. Now, I'll just give kind of maybe a parallel example to this just quickly, because I think this is more accessible for some people. Years ago, I went to the library. I always like to say this is the kind of day when my colleagues wonder why it is that I earn a salary. But I went to the library and I had ordered to the library, this is literally a true story, every self-help book about gratitude that had been published in the last 25 years. I mean, and when I got there, I thought to myself, I should have brought a wheelbarrow, right? It was just like immense. And I took all these books to a Carol in the library, and I can't say I read all of them, but I read at them. You know, I would read the first few pages, I would read the conclusion, and I was really taken aback by the fact that probably fully a third of these books said something like, the goal is to feel grateful all the time. And I remember thinking, that has got to be wrong. What if I just got a cancer diagnosis 5 minutes ago? What if, God forbid, I'm driving home from my wife's funeral? What if my child is in the hospital and I don't know if they'll make it? It can't be that the goal is to feel grateful all the time. What I can talk about is being oriented around gratitude, right? I don't know how many of you watched Rachel Goldberg, Hirsch Goldberg Poland's mom's eulogy. I have the privilege of knowing that family for a long time. And one of the things that was really amazing is that if you notice, Rachel actually talked about how grateful she was for the gift of Hirsch. I'm sure that the primary thing she was feeling in that moment was not gratitude, but unbearable grief. But she's oriented around gratitude. That's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about orienting our lives around love. Sorry if that was a long-winded answer.
Oh, can I just, if I might ask, like, did you ever think about not using the word love because it pulls in this other direction?
Yes. So not only did I think about it, I thought about it a lot, and I still think about it a lot. But look, you know, as I think I say in the book, we use the word love really badly a lot of times in our culture, but the alternative to that is not to not use the word love anymore, which is not going to happen at any rate, but to teach ourselves to use it better. Right? You know, in other words, that's not, you know, Martin Buber says something similar about God. You know, like that word is so sullied and so abused and so many, I wish I could stop using it. I can't stop using it. I just have to find ways to use it better. Right? So that's what I'm trying to do with love. And admittedly, you know, love, John, you asked this, you know, at the outset, and I didn't even get to it. I'm using love to translate a kind of array of Jewish words. Ahava is the most obvious one. Chesed is another. I talk in passing in the book about how in Aramaic, the word rachama means love. So compassion is a species of love, I think, in Jewish thought. I mean, there's a whole bunch of Jewish words that I'm rendering here. And of course, you know, chesed is a wonderful example of how there are always words that are untranslatable from one language to another, right? If you simply open up translations of either the Bible on the one hand or rabbinic literature on the other hand, and you see all the ways that chesed is translated, you realize it's an untranslatable word. So you have to sort of be willing to talk about a lot of different things. I mean, one of the things that I try to talk about in the book a little bit is that love, as I think philosophers tend to use it, is an umbrella for a lot of different kinds of feelings and postures. The kind of love I feel for my spouse, the kind of love I feel for my child, the kind of love I might feel for my neighbor, kind of love I might feel for a friend, compassion, gratitude. Those are all species of love. I don't think we can live without the word is sort of the bottom line.
The image I was getting as you were speaking, Shai, about an orientation to the world is I was imagining, you know, when you go to get your eyes checked and you go to the optometrist and they put down the lenses, you know, better, worse, right? That it feels like it's like taking on one of those, looking through one of those machines, right? And finding the chesed lens or the love lens, you know, knowing that that's within our toolkit, that we have that we can change the lens, you know, for better, for worse.
So I love that. I think it's really actually really important. One of the things that I sort of added, I kind of interspersed this in the book, I admit, in a late stage of writing, because I hadn't fully registered how important I think this was in Jewish sources, and actually how important it was in my own thinking, just hadn't been crystallized for me, is that love, in addition to being a way of feeling and acting and willing, love is very much also a way of seeing, right? It is a way we see other people. To use a term from traditional rabbinic Hebrew, it is about the cultivation of ayin tova, of a generous eye. When I see, I mean, the example of this that I would give almost, you know, a little bit overly playfully is, you know, when I walk into a supermarket and I see someone I've never met, what narrative do I immediately tell myself about them? You ever had the experience, maybe I'll just, you know, embarrass myself here, of being in a grocery store with someone, you've never spoken to them, you know nothing about them, but you already extremely intensely dislike them? Because you constructed this whole story about who they must be because of what shirt they're wearing, because of how they're like all this crazy stuff that we do. And what happens if we actually stop ourselves and imagine, wait a minute, the person in front of me is infinitely valuable. God loves the person in front of me. The person in front of me is infinitely precious. What can I train myself to see people differently? When I see people in my life, do I see immediately a catalog of faults or a real flesh and blood human being with struggles not so differently from my own? I think that's really, really fundamental. And actually, if this is a funny way to put it, simultaneously very simple and very hard work. It's like a very simple notion, and yet I think for a lot of us, it's a lot of work, right? And how do I see the people I don't particularly like? That's when the work really starts to get hard, right? Someone I don't get along with is not a monster. They're just someone I have trouble getting along with. Even that is a shift in the perspective towards love.
Right. So I'm sort of guessing in my own mind the answer already to the next question I'm going to ask you, but it's coming out of what you just said. And the question is, you know, why now? Like, why did you write this book now? What was it that provoked you? I'm sure you've been thinking these things, and I've read your Torah love, you know, many different Torah, and a lot of these themes are there as well. But why did you feel the need at this time to put this together under this umbrella term of love, bringing love forward in this book at this time?
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting because I have to be honest and say that this book sort of emerged on two time frames, right? One is that this book has been kind of gestating in me for probably 25 years. And
Yeah.
I finally wrote it when I could no longer not write it. I don't mean that to sound grandiose. I sort of feel like that's how writing works. I often tell it to grad students who are thinking of, you know, going to grad school in the humanities. I always tell them, you know, if you can not do this, don't do it. That's the best test. You only do this if you can't not. And that's a little bit how I felt about this book. And if I could back up for a minute and share a story, I know some of you have heard me share, it really sort of set the course of my life as an educator and a teacher. Something that happened more than 2 decades ago where I was speaking to a group of fifth-year students at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And I said to them in passing, in the midst of a discussion of something else, Judaism is a story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And one of the students said, much more sneeringly than I report in the book, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me. And that experience it was very shattering for me. It was so shocking to me, and as I report in the book, I said to him, I'm so taken aback by your reaction, because when I said that, I was actually thinking of the twice a day Jewish liturgy in which we say, God, with vast love have you loved us. And then immediately we recite Deuteronomy chapter 6, you should love the Lord your God. In other words, a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. So if you hear that and your thought is that sounds like Christianity, then there's a much more fundamental conversation we need to have about just how deeply so many Jews, including passionate, knowledgeable, serious Jews, have internalized this traditional Christian anti-Jewish idea. Now, I wish I could say, oh, yes, I began to write the book that very night. There'd be like a great story there. That's not how it works. It took me years to realize how much that story was sort of living inside of me. It really just kind of took me aback. And in ways I wasn't fully conscious of, it set the agenda for much of my teaching and writing over the last 2 decades. Now, I didn't share in the book, and I now wish I had, that I had a parallel experience with some Christian kids that also really deeply impacted me. It was just a few months after this. I was teaching a group of high school kids. Forgive me, I'm losing my voice as I'm talking here. I was speaking to a group of Protestant high school kids. The story of how I got to them, not really that interesting, but what you do need to know is that they were selected based on their devoutness and their leadership ability in their church. So again, I'm having a discussion with them, and in passing, I say, okay, guys, these are high schoolers. So I say, remind me, what does Jesus say is the great command? And they all raise their hand. I say to one of them, I call on one of them, and he very proudly says, love of God and love of neighbor. And then innocently, with no agenda at all, I say, and now remind me, what is Jesus quoting? And not a single hand goes up. Not a single hand goes up. And I was shocked. This is totally like revelatory to me. The answer, by the way, of course, is Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Vayikra and Devarim. And I realized in that moment, oh, this is how Christianity has traditionally been able to tell a story about Judaism as loveless. You don't teach your kids what wells Jesus drank from. You don't know where he got the love. That's amazing. And I developed sort of in the back of my mind this sort of like second agenda, which was to write a book for Christians who understand that what they were taught about Judaism is obsolete at best and offensive or even obscene at worst, and want to be able to talk differently and don't know how. So I had very much also this secondary audience in mind. And one of the most, I would say, kind of enriching experiences I've ever had in my career has been this kind of grand tour of Christian podcasts I've done in the last few months. It's been, I mean, obviously, the Christians I'm talking to are self-selecting, right? It's not like I'm, reaching hundreds of thousands of Christians, but, there are a lot of people who really very badly want to learn to think and talk about Judaism and to Jews in very different ways. So, that's sort of the background of where this agenda kind of hit me. It also, look, this sounds almost cliche to say, we live in a society that feels so suffused with hatred and mutual disdain that I actually, as I was writing this book, I found it more and more powerful as an experience of thinking about, what prescriptions do our ancient religious traditions have for healing what ails modernity? I'm not comparing myself to him, but just as an example, one of the things that I think is so interesting about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's writings is the extent to which he clearly sees Judaism as an antidote to what is most sick about modernity.
Yes.
Right? Modernity is all about exploiting the world, taking advantage of it, using it. And religion is all about appreciation, right? It's about a different posture towards the world. In a very different way, one of the things I'm trying to talk about is what a different posture towards human beings. I mean, here's a I mean, I feel real almost trite saying this, but it is so potent. I experience this every day of my life as even just a semi-public person, right? What social media has made possible in terms of how we are willing to speak to other human beings. And what would it mean to actually allow Torah to tell us, wait a minute, that's not how we speak.
Yeah.
That's not what you say to another person. You don't
Yeah.
call another Jew a capo, right? You don't, that's not how we talk, right? There's a human being on the other end of that conversation, right? They are infinitely precious. How will you speak accordingly? It's very basic stuff, but there's that word orientation again. It's how do we orient ourselves?
So the times that we're living in, obviously, right, was very provocative to you, as well as these other situations in terms of like what is needed, what is some medicine that we
Right.
need now in our society, in our world. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to turn to John. I feel like
Well, I just wanted like about that. So, we and actually Shai, I think you posted some things recently about how when people talk about this, we often point our fingers at other people and other groups who are deficient in this area. But I was thinking about, pointing the finger at myself, and I won't point at anybody here, but maybe you'll identify, because I know that as I encountered your book, I had thoughts like, I bet he regrets publishing it this year of all years. Who's going to talk about this? And I think a feeling in myself of like, gosh, why? Like I have to, it's Shai's book. It was also, Sharon Browse's book. And like I have to think about this because I don't feel like it or didn't naturally go there. It's not that I don't think I was trying to think about some of these messages, but you put love in the center at a time when this is going to sound, like a self-aggrandizing, when even for me who thinks I think about this was having a hard time doing it. And I wonder if it's hard to access the world of serious haters. But in terms of have you had any insight, I guess is what I was going to say, into the folks who are responsive and who want very much to learn this Torah and are finding it hard? Like, what's the obstacle? Have you noticed any particular things about those obstacles as you've gone out and encountered people? Even the amount of like, I really do want to think about this, but just not now. Not during this Shiva period, not during this year.
It's interesting. I really appreciate that question because I feel like this is something where, as my book came out, I read the proverbial crowd totally wrong. And what I mean by that is, so the galleys, the pre-publication version of my book, arrived at our home on Saturday morning, October 14th. And I remember very, very vividly turning to my wife, to Rachel, and saying, I literally could not imagine caring about this book any less right now. And if any of you have ever written a book, that is not a normal reaction that an author has to a book that they've been working on for years finally arriving. And it took me 4 days. It took me, I think it was Wednesday afternoon, before I even opened the box of the galleys. If you've ever written the book, that's meshuggah. Nobody does that. But I just felt so, I don't want to talk about love. All I want to do is like sit on the floor and sob and scream. I don't want to talk about any of this. And then something extremely moving happened. And I have to say, I'm still struggling with it. It's 11 months later, and I still don't find this easy. But I started saying to colleagues at Hadar and to certain friends, mostly professional colleagues, I don't know what to do. I don't want this book to come out. Like, I don't want to talk about any of this. So it's even hard for me to talk about this now without crying. I don't want to talk about this. And almost to a head, people said to me, you have this totally backwards. I understand what you're saying, but you're totally wrong. I want to talk about and hear about love now more than I've ever wanted to hear about it in my life. And I have to say, my initial reaction over and over and over again for those first few weeks was, I really don't get what you're saying. That is so, as he say in Israeli saying, ani lo sham, right? That is just not what I'm feeling right now at all. And then I realized something that really overwhelmed me, actually, which is that the reaction of a lot of those people was actually confirming something that I had written about in what I thought of as a fairly kind of insignificant, almost a throwaway chapter of the book that in retrospect, I think may be the most important chapter of the book. It's funny how that happens, which is I've always been struck by this very odd thing we do in the Jewish calendar. As you all know, the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, is the day in which, in Jewish memory at least, everything bad that ever happened on Tisha B'Av. The first temple was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed. The generation that went out from Egypt learned that they would not enter the land. Every crusade, everything horrible that happens, we remember it on Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah, right? First code of Jewish law, the Mishnah, 2 paragraphs after telling us about Tisha B'Av, tells us that the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, 6 days later, was one of the 2 happiest days of the year. And why? Because young women would go out into the fields dressed in white, and they would meet young men, and they would couple off. And I have to say that for years, I found this Mishnah to be just somewhere between strange and unhinged, right? Imagine I'm sitting at a shiva after a massive devastation, and I say, hey guys, I know what we should do. Let's have a singles party. You would all look at me like I was out of my mind. What is this person talking about, right? It's inappropriate at best, and it's just like emotionally totally disconnected at worst. And it sort of hit me as I was working on the book that the sages of the Talmud were actually doing something exceptionally moving. They were basically saying, on the 9th of Av, it's all about trauma. It's all about devastation. It's all about shutting down. What does trauma do? It almost physically makes us go like this. And so you know what the rabbis do? They come and they say, let's have a holiday that's about love. Let's actually insist on restoring the possibility of relationships and families and caring for one another precisely when we're most tempted to shut down. It's actually sort of breathtaking. And I realized that all of these people who were saying to me, you have this wrong, you even have this backwards, they were unconsciously, I imagine, right, tapping into this really deep insight that the Mishnah was animated by. Just when people were feeling totally devastated and distraught and abandoned by their purported allies and all these other experiences, they were basically saying, talk to me about love. That's like a deep, that is, we sometimes use, Jewish values in America in the most cliche possible ways, right? That's a Jewish value at a whole different level, right? I'm not going to allow trauma to shut down the ability to talk about love. And I'll share something else that I haven't talked about a lot, but it's, it's related. My editor, I'm sorry about my voice, by the way, my editor at Farrar Straus called me, I think it was around October 10th or 11th. It was the same week. And he said, we never do this. Once a book has been sent out to be printed as galleys, it's done. Done. There's no conversation. But I have to ask you, do you think you need to add or take away anything in this book in light of what's happening? I was very moved by the question. I actually remember being almost speechless. I like, give me 24 hours. And when I came back to him with, at the time, and it'll be clear in a minute why I'm sharing this, what I basically said, anything that I were to write right now, I will regret 3 weeks from now. There is absolutely no way I can say anything that is speaking from some self that I will recognize in 3 weeks. I feel like a shell of a person right now. I'm not writing a book that's going to be part of my posterity in a moment like this. I don't mean that to sound grandiose. It's just like, I don't want my grandchildren taking a book off the shelf written by their grandpa and seeing, well, Saba was completely unhinged in 2024. Like, it's just not what I'm going for. But then I think over time, what I've realized is also what's really important to me is I will not allow anti-Semites ever to define what I understand Judaism to be, right? The experience of the world being hostile to me or whatever, however you want to process, right, will never move me to say the heart of Jewish life is something other than what I understand the heart of Jewish life to be. I refuse to cede the power to do that to anyone but me and my fellow Jews and our reading of the tradition. That's just really very important to me. And anything that I would have said there, I think would have sullied what I was trying to do in this book. Let me stop there for now.
All right, so I'm going to push a little bit on this topic, just a little bit deeper into it. So
Please.
I'm going to quote you from the book because it's such a beautiful quote, and then ask you a question. So you wrote, "The deepest response to the problem of evil is to walk in God's ways, to be a vehicle for God's mercy. At the end of the day, for me, the only response to the problem of evil and suffering that really matters is this: whether or not we help God bring love and compassion to places of darkness and affliction." So my question is, given the fact that we are in living trauma since October 7th, and then re-stimulated this past week with the horror of those executions. How do you think, like moving from, theology a little bit more towards praxis, like towards the practical, how, when confronting such cruelty and horror and such devastation and trauma of the heart and existential fear, how do we move this theology into psychology and into practice?
Right. I mean, that is, I guess, on some level, ultimately the question, probably for all times, only especially poignantly at times like this, right? I mean, how do we move this into some concrete way? So I think that the first thing that I would be inclined to say is that, and this is kind of a sort of a different part of the book that we haven't spoken about, but I think it's important not to be ashamed or apologetic about, in moments of utter devastation, our first impulse being to hold those near to us close. Like, I make no apologies for the fact that Rachel and John's kid registers with me in a different way than people I've never met. Now, what I would not make an apology for is if only the people close to me ever matter to me. But in moments of trauma and devastation, I think turning towards our community and holding each other is exactly what we're supposed to do. It's part of what it means to be human, I think, in the deepest sense. I think the question then becomes, how do we carry, the sort of the second question is, how do we carry ourselves in the world in light of all the pain and the disappointment that we are experiencing? That's, in some ways, I would say, harder. And it makes me want to go back to that discussion of the 15th of Av in the wake of the 9th of Av. The point that the sages are making, I think, is not, that all we need in the face of devastation is love. We need lots of things. We need fortitude. We need courage. We need to make sure that our enemies can't do it again. Like, there's a lot of things we need, right?
Yeah.
Love is not ever all you need, the Beatles notwithstanding. That's not. So, and I don't think they're saying all you need is love. They're saying, don't forget, amidst all the incredibly urgent and difficult things that we have to do in response to devastation, that love is really central and fundamental, and you can't do without it. I think that one of the greatest spiritual challenges that the Bible lays before people, and I don't begin to really know how to make sense of this in my own life yet in the wake of October 7th, but we are supposed to learn compassion from our suffering. That doesn't mean we don't also have other experiences, anger, disappointment, disheartenedness, a lot of things. But part of the narrative of the Torah is that our experience of enslavement, of prolonged abuse at the hands of the Egyptians, is meant to teach us compassion. We will need to begin to have that conversation as Jews. Like, what will we learn from this moment that is not just necessary sobriety, That is not a new awakeness to who we can and can't rely on. All those things are real and important and even urgent. But we can't miss on the spiritual, ethical conversation too, which is Gerim hiyatem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You were strangers in the land of Egypt, and therefore what? And that's a conversation I think very few Jews are ready for emotionally, but it's one that we will have to have. This, by the way, is not some veiled political statement about the war. It's not that at all. I mean, some might interpret it that way, and that's okay. But I am actually talking about something much more general, which is when you take on board the experiences of the Jewish people and you personalize them, which is a big piece of what Jewish spirituality is. So what are the ethical and spiritual implications of that? And I suspect, right or wrong, I don't know, that October 7th will land in the historical memory in a very deep way. And so we'll have to ask, what are the things? We know some of what we learned from that day, but what about some of the harder, longer term stuff, like learning to recommit to love?
So kind of in that vein, I think about, just the last thing you said, Jewish experience, and the many layers of suffering and harm, and how and what we say about that, and most of what you say, I think, is not about the love part, or it's not the first thing. We have our life of mitzvot, which we can and we know we should, see as a path toward love and toward shalom, but also can sometimes just take us up as a thing in and of itself, self-referentially, and also not inconsequentially. We have this Torah, which, on the face of it, even in that core story, even in the Exodus story, does is also a story of violence and in which God, I mean, we have these, God does refer to Yisrael as, B'ni Bechori, as my precious firstborn son, but all of this, but you could certainly be forgiven for looking at the Torah. And you talk about this, I think, when you open the section of the book where you kind of start to build this theology. And there's a lot of stuff in the way of seeing Judaism being about love. Like, you have to work toward that.
Mm-hmm.
And, in a way, Kaya's question was kind of like, how do we do that? How do we practice that? And I think, certainly you could say more about that. And part of that, I wonder, is like, do you think that the in a way, the obstacles from within our Torah, from within our experience, is that part of the thing? Like, is it important for us to go through the midrashic process of turning the Torah of a God who also seems to be angry at times, or the people who seem to be angry and things like that, and to find the theology of love? Like, is that something we have to do, or is that in the way, and we should just go straight to the end point, right? Read the end of your chapter on theology. Do we have to go through what is it seems like there are some things in Judaism that are set up to not make love what Judaism is about, I guess. And
yeah, so I appreciate that question, which I think you could hear that question on multiple levels, which is, so one of them, and John, stop me if this is totally not one of the levels that you were referring to, is, a tradition by definition is very vast and therefore cacophonous. There are like a lot of different voices. If you spend your time studying Tanakh and rabbinic literature and later Jewish spiritual literature, you'll hear a lot of things and their opposites, right? About almost anything that you say, Judaism says X about Y. If you know your way around, you can also find a way to say, yeah, but it also says not X about that, or maybe even anti-X about that. And one of the things that I want to argue for in general, in terms of what it means to inherit a tradition, is to be conscious of the fact that we are all choosing to emphasize certain things and place them at the center of our sort of interpretive project, if you will. Everybody does that. Not everyone admits they do that, but everybody does that. When the sages of the Talmud have a discussion in which, for example, Rabbi Akiva, no less a figure than Rabbi Akiva, right, says, love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle of the Torah, he's making an interpretive decision. He could have said, wipe out the memory of Amalek. That is the greatest principle of the Torah. He could have said, wear tzitzit. That is a great principle of the Torah. But no, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. That is a great principle of the Torah. I think one of the things that does is license us and maybe even require us to make decisions about what we read in light of what, right? What we think of as the interpretive center of the tradition. But what I am not saying is, and therefore we throw everything else out. That is not how you inherit a tradition, I think. What it means to live inside of a tradition or a culture is to live with its ragged edges too. There are texts in the Torah, I'm happy to talk about them. I mean, there are texts in Tanakh that I find very, very difficult to live with. And my goal in this book and in general as an educator or as a thinker is not to wrap the tradition up in a bow and make it all perfect and wonderful. That's a different project. There are people who do that. It's not my agenda. I actually want to invite people at one and the same time to be willing to say certain things are at the center, and a tradition is really vast and contains a lot of voices. And one of the things that means is we have to interpret responsibly, right? I say in the introduction, and I mean this, that someone could write a book called Judaism is About Hate and marshal a fair number of sources to make that case. I think it would be a poorer reading of the tradition than the one that I'm offering, but it's not impossible. And that means we have to be sober and self-conscious about what we're doing. I think that's kind of really very fundamental. John, I will say, since you gave the example of a God who gets angry, I try to argue in this book something that is, I know, counterintuitive to a lot of American Jews and would have been counterintuitive to me not so long ago in my own life, which is I want to defend the idea of divine anger. And that's because of having been really influenced by an essay totally unrelated to Judaism by a moral philosopher named Peter Strawson. Peter Strawson argues that anger is what he calls a moral emotion. And what he means by that is, let's imagine that I see, forgive me, Linda, we don't know each other, but I see you on my screen. I see Linda walk up to someone she doesn't know and kick them in the head. And I say, oh, okay. So either I don't think there's anything wrong with kicking someone in the head, or I don't respect Linda enough to get upset with her. I don't respect her enough to, right, to have a response. And what Strawson says is, if I get angry at Linda for behaving badly, that is paradoxically a show of respect for the fact that Linda is an agent. And I believe she has the power to make choices in her life. Linda, I'm sorry. I don't know. You're just an example, right? So that really hit me theologically, because I think if the Bible believes anything, it believes this amazingly interesting and sort of crazy idea, which is the God who brought the world into being takes human beings seriously as agents. And that means that God is disappointed in and sometimes even angry at people. What I find hard about divine anger in the Bible is not the fact of divine anger, it's the extreme violence and overkill of how that violence is reported. I will also say that, you know, one of the things, as Kaya mentioned in the introduction, you know, my first book was about Rabbi Abraham and Joshua Heschel. One of the things that I'm sort of struck by all these years later is how some of the things that he said that most stayed with me were actually throwaway comments that he makes in passing. And he says in one place, maybe in two places in his corpus, he says, you know, some people are embarrassed by the idea of divine anger. But for those of us who lived through the century we lived through, divine anger is actually a source of comfort, because it means that somewhere in the universe, somebody actually does care. I still, all these years later, I'm not sure what I make of that, but I find it actually almost physically arresting. Like I almost can't breathe when I think about that, because it's so turned on its head, you know, this assumption that divine anger is something I'm supposed to be embarrassed about. And he basically says, no, quite the contrary. You know, at the end of the 20th century, a God who didn't get angry would be an irrelevance. You know, we could talk about that for many, many hours. What do we mean by that? How literally do we mean it? Right? There's a million things we can say, but I'm sort of complicating the picture even more, John, if I could, by saying some of the things that we want to write off I'm not always sure we should be so quick to write off. One of the things that I find myself wondering about a little bit lately, this may be a weird thing to say, is what are the things in Jewish tradition that don't speak to me at all that my great-great-grandchildren might find unbelievably basic and fundamental, right? When you inherit something as vast and as multifaceted as the Jewish tradition, different things register as fundamental in different times.
Yeah, and we're going to turn to the questions. I think that my thought is not so much about the things that are, I guess my thought is about there's a lot that is keeping us occupied in Jewish consciousness and even in Torah that that could distract us from love. And I think, but I think we'll come back at the end towards something more.
So John, let me, if I could just say one more sentence, because I think it's actually really interesting. There was an Israeli rabbi named Elimelech Bar Shaul. He was the chief rabbi of Rehovot. Okay. He wrote this book about the emotions in Judaism. I think maybe 50 people read it. But he says this really beautiful thing. He says, what does it mean to say that love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle of Torah? He says, we get distracted. Even just trying to deal with we get distracted by 1,000,001 obligations, responsibilities, sometimes even moral calculations. And what it means to say, I don't know if this is the pshat in Rabbi Akiva, but who cares, right? He says, what it means to say, love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle of the Torah is, sort of like in the moments where you forget what you're supposed to be oriented around. Comes Rabbi Akiva and says, it's about love. All of these different obligations we have towards other people, at the end of the day, they're about love. They're about caring about people. And so I think things like that, in light of what you're describing, John, are really, really important, which is like, do we have constant reminders? Do rabbis get up on a regular basis in their synagogues and say, is any of this making us more loving? Okay, this is an embarrassing thing to admit. And my only defense is that I was younger and more, I don't know, smug. I don't know, when we first started the yeshiva at Hadar that we have, the full-time study program, it was like the second summer we had a summer program. We're in a new organization. There was a Beit Midrash, a study hall full of young adults studying Talmud. And there was this one morning, I was fighting the impulse to just stop them in the middle of this Talmud Seder, like, this people sitting, studying Talmud, saying, excuse me, is anyone in this room growing in love right now? And if you're not, what the hell are you doing here? And then I realized, you know what? That's probably not helpful. First of all, this is not 1830s Poland, and you are not a Hasidic Rebbe. You can't act like that. But the point, the impulse was very real. I wanted them to think about it. I wanted me to think about it. Here I am building a Jewish institution. Is it oriented around teaching people how to love? That question really matters.
Yes. It's kind of, again, bringing it back to the practical, to how do we actually live this? So I'm going to turn now to the community that's here and invite you all, if you have questions, to put them into the chat box, and John and I will read them off. And I'm going to start right now, a little shift in the direction of the conversation with Judy's question, which is, how do you feel about the formulation, God is love? Is that too limiting of God's infinity, or are God's attributes all aspects of love? Can we say Baruch Atah Ahava?
So I'm going to give you an answer that sounds like it might be surprising or even unsettling. I have never and will never say God is love, because God is love is a Trinitarian formula from Christianity. The statement God is love is actually about parts of the Trinity loving each other. It's about how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all loving each other. And so that even before there's a world, there's love taking place within God. I never say God is love. I don't think it's a Jewish formulation. I think the Jewish formulation is God is loving, but not that God is love. That's a good example. We didn't talk about this, but one of the dangers that I experienced in working on this book, and it took me a while to realize how deep the danger was, and I had to kind of almost recalibrate, was because I wanted to argue that Christianity was not the only religion of love, that Judaism is also a religion of love. By the way, Buddhism is also a religion of love. Different discussion, right? But I wanted to make sure that people weren't hearing me as saying, oh, Judaism was just Christianity before there was Christianity. It was very important for me to say, oh, no, there are a lot of things we share in common. And there are also a lot of really fundamental things theologically, as well as in our visions of love, that are really different. That we tend to talk about love in very different ways, in certain ways, than Christians tend to talk about love. And this might be one of them. God is love is a very Christian formulation. I see a lot of liberal rabbis using it, and I think they just don't know that, which is to me unfortunate, because I think it's there's something very assimilatory about that formulation. I don't like it. But I love what underlies your question is: can we say that all aspects of God are? I lost the language, but are they're all on some level aspects of love? I don't know the answer to that. I love that question. It's like really actually quite profound. I think. I mean, I'm tempted to say something that is confusing to me, which is for Maimonides, all of the divine attributes are really one attribute. They're all sort of, God doesn't have multiple parts. So God is love and God is justice and God is loving and God is just and God is mercy. They're all part of a soup. Ask me that question over email in 3 months and I'll try to give you a better answer. How's that? I'm trying to work that question through, honestly, more clearly. I think that it's important for me to say, I'm not saying, I mean, I hope this goes without saying, love is the only Jewish value or the only thing God cares about, right? I'll tell you, some of you might find this fun. This is like Jews in our craziness. My colleague, Rabbi Ethan Tucker, who some of you have studied with, I know, he said something to me that I thought was so smart in its almost absurd simplicity. He said to me after a book launch that I had done, he said, you don't understand your own title. You keep talking as if the title of your book is Judaism is about love. That's not what the title is. The title is Judaism is about love. Meaning you're not saying Judaism is about love as opposed to a lot of other things it's also about. You're saying, in contrast to the way people tend to think about it, Judaism really is fundamentally about love. It's one of the most fundamental things Judaism is about. And that's exactly right. That is exactly what I was trying to say. Judaism is about love is not a comprehensive thesis. It's a provocation, meaning the title, right? It's meant to be like, oh. And I'll show, by the way, how much of a provocation is it? So if you go over to your bookshelf and you look at nonfiction titles, you will notice that publishers never allow a title that is a full sentence. It's just not what you do. I think any book you like, take some classic Jewish books in the 20th century, Halachic Man, I and Thou, God in Search of Man. It's not a sentence. And when I went to my editor and I said, I have an idea for a title, how about Judaism is about love? I thought he would laugh at me. That's not a title, that's a sentence. And he said something that both really moved me and saddened me. He said, oh, that would be really surprising to a lot of readers. We should really think about that. And I thought, why is that surprising? That's crazy. But here, the fact that they went with that title tells you how much of a provocation that sentence felt like, even to, smart people who publish books all the time.
Great.
By the way, Man is Not Alone is another exception I realized the other night. Abraham Joshua Heschel's other great book. Same publisher, one sentence, but it's very rare.
Yes. So I'm still looking to see if there's any more questions that this community would like to ask. I'm not seeing any more in the chat. So I just want to give you another.
We have answered all the questions of the universe.
Maybe so.
Maybe I will
John.
sort of pick up on this previous question. Whoops, where'd I go? And because I think that, I thought maybe in a very simple, I'm not a STEM guy, but water is H2O. There's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. I don't know if that means there's more hydrogen or not, but whatever. Like, would it be possible to say that of the things that constitute divinity or the divine example for us, that love is more than the other things, or that love is the one that is holding together the other important attributes?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Right. So, one of the things, sorry, one of the things that I tried to do in the book, and I, in retrospect, should have drawn more attention to it, but I'm not even sure how conscious it was. I tried over the course of the book to talk about how love might relate to some of the things that people tend to think that Judaism is really about. So Judaism is about law. So I tried to sort of argue in multiple places in the book that in Judaism, law is never an alternative to love. Law is a manifestation of love. Go back to that prayer, Ahava Rabbah Avtanu, with vast love have you loved us, right? Torah mitzvot limadatanu, you gave us commandments. Law is a manifestation of love. Or law and love is law is a manifestation of love, right? Then love and justice. On one level, they're held up in tension with each other. We all know that mercy and judgment can feel really hard to make sense of and how to choose between them. And yet there are ways that justice is driven by an engine of love for the world. Meaning, I was trying to show the ways in which I don't think love is necessarily intention. You don't have to choose among those values. And it may even be helpful to see love as a kind of animating force that brings all these things together. I just didn't, the overly grand claim I didn't want to make is Judaism is about love, and any other ending to the sentence of what Judaism is about will therefore be mistaken. You know what I'm saying? That's not what I meant to say. You can say Judaism is about law, as long as you understand that law is one of the manifestations of love, and Judaism is not only about law. You could say Judaism is about law, but you can't say Judaism is about law, right? You could say Judaism is about justice, but you can't say Judaism is about justice. That's the point I was really trying to get at.
See, we are, again, we're eager if you can formulate, if you have a question you want to formulate. Oh, there we go. Here comes a question here.
Yes.
Oh, it's a good one.
So it says, can hate be a part of love?
Can I ask Barbara and Liz for another sentence about what's really behind that question and what it means? That's too provocative for me. I want to understand what's driving it. I don't know. Are they able to unmute? Is that something we can do? Or
I'm gonna make that possible. If you give me 1 second. They should be able to now unmute Barbara and Liz. And we'll maybe change, yeah. Do I have to remove the spotlight to see them speak?
You guys, or either of you, should be able to talk. Oh, can't.
They can't unmute. So let me try that one more time. With themselves, yes. Saying that you should be able to. I'm sorry, let me try one more thing.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Great.
So in the light of October 7th, and in the light of what happened this week, I feel that love as an orientation is just a wonderful concept, but there is so much despair and hate in my feelings this week. And I'm not proud of it, but I just wonder where where hate can be included in this orientation toward love, if that is even possible. Thank you. I just love listening to you talk.
Thank you. Thank you also for the rawness of that question, which I really appreciate. I think my first reaction, I mean, one of the things I'll just say, it's funny, if you'll permit me a 1-sentence detour, John, you asked me something earlier that this brings to mind that I never really got to, which is what I have found traveling around the country in the last 5 months is a degree of searchingness and open-heartedness that has simply blown me away, that seems to me to be in a whole deeper place than I've ever experienced before. Now, again, it's self-selecting, people who are choosing to come to a talk about a book called Judaism is About Love. But I just feel like the conversations about what does it mean to be alive in a world like this have been so real and so raw and so powerful that it has been like a really humbling and moving experience. I mean, those words even feel totally inadequate to what I'm talking about. And this question, feels, of a piece with that, in that it is so real and raw. And I think the hard thing about questions like this is that I'm always tempted to say, wait, can you give me a month and then let's get back on this call and I'll tell you what I think. So I want to say that I'm not sure hate can be included in love, but I don't think that means hate can't be included in life and in being open to the sheer range of what we experience as a result of making our way through this world. Right? In other words, I think if we care about people and they're violated, the impulse to feel hate is totally understandable. I think it's also often dangerous, and we have to work hard to keep it under control, that we not make decisions from that part of our heart and that part of our mind. But I struggle with this. Because on one level, you might say hate is included in love. Let's say, God forbid, you have a child who is violated by another person, and you feel that your love and protectiveness of that child makes you hate the person who treated them that way. Is that an aspect of love? I'm like sort of disinclined to say that, but I'm not sure that I'm right. I mean, a certain kind of ferocity is part of love, right? There is a kind of ferocity. Those of us who have been blessed with having children, for example, there's a kind of the mother bear thing that is just very intense. I think that my impulse is always to go somewhere else, which is, can we respond to ourselves and our feelings of hate with compassion and kindness? Right? It's actually bringing love to the hate and the anger that we feel, which is also a way of lessening their power over us. But I genuinely, sincerely wish we could talk about this again. I will be thinking about this question for a while, and I don't have a good answer. Maybe I'll say some might find this interesting. There are some writers in the Musar tradition, for example, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, just so we're kind of right, who say hate is always a vice. There is never a situation where hate is acceptable. And then, and for a long time I thought, okay, that makes sense. And then I wondered, is that true? Or can you simply declare that? Or do you need to argue that? Is it possible that, I don't know, loving everyone I encounter, but hating Saddam Hussein and Vladimir Putin is a fully virtuous way of going through the world? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think these are really, really difficult questions. And we didn't talk about this either, but the most difficult chapter in this book for me to write by a lot was the chapter on whether there is a mitzvah to love your enemies or not. And I won't go into the depths of that now at 8:08 p.m., but there's a lot to talk about there. And I would just say the conversation is way more complex than truisms tend to allow for.
There's a
Oh.
were you going to read that, Kaya? Sharon's comment?
Actually, I will.
Oh.
The last one says, this is Sharon Eidelberg-Spratt saying, Judaism is about love, and therefore it pushes us to fully immerse ourselves in love. I see it as a challenge. It is a guardrail that opens pathways of connection, understanding, bafflement, and all take me back to what I want to turn to, and that is love.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful, wonderful formulation. Thank you.
I was kind of, yeah, Kaya.
Yeah,
Sorry.
in what we were just talking about before regarding hate, I was reminded of, our tradition does try to give us some way of responding to that natural response of hate or even feelings of vengeance. And there's the story of Bruria. It comes through a woman in the Talmud, one of the very few teachers who are cited in the Talmud who was a woman. the wife of Rabbi Meir. And there's a story that's told about Rabbi Meir getting very, very angry and praying for the death of these particular two men in his community that were involved in acts of violation of one form or another. And he was praying that they should die. And she stopped him. And she said, you shouldn't pray. You know, God is a God of chesed. I can't remember the quote she uses from, I think from Psalms or from somewhere, maybe you remember, Shai. But essentially her teaching is that you should pray that what's evil about them is not them, it's their deeds, right? It's what they did. Those are evil actions. And what you should be praying for is not that they should die, but that they should repent, that they should come to an understanding of love, that they should grow in themselves and do teshuva, some kind of return to come to understand that we're here for love, for the purpose of loving and not hurting one another. And it's, you know, it's a beautiful story. I love that it comes through the mouth of a woman, of course. And at the same time, it's still really hard. You know, it's still really hard to do that, to pray in that way for those changes to take place. But it is a path.
Yeah, I'll just say, just to make life sort of just even more complicated, one of the things I love about that story is that she actually deliberately misinterprets the verse.
Right.
Meaning she's quoting a verse from Psalm 104, Yitamu chataim min haaretz, which literally clearly means may sinners be eliminated from the land. She chooses, based on later Hebrew, to hear chataim as meaning sins rather than sinners, right? And says it doesn't say that that sinner should disappear, but that sin should disappear. It's an amazing midrashic moment, which I love because it actually is about, yeah, these texts are meant to be wrestled with, struggled, creatively misinterpreted. You know, I had an experience just a couple days ago where, and Kai, I don't know whether this resonates with what you were talking about. And John, this is an example of the kinds of things people have said to me, which is just, a woman came up to me after a dialogue I did about the book and said, my husband beat me and my kids. I have hated him my whole life. Is there a mitzvah that I'm supposed to love him? Because I don't begin to know where that would come from. And, you know, of course, it's like, your first thing you want to do is just be like, well, first of all, right, thank you for the sheer, I don't know what, the like vulnerability of saying that out loud to me, who you've never met, you know, and inviting me into the most difficult conversation of your life. And what I said to her, and I, you know, I don't know whether I think this was the best response. I said, listen, you know, my first reaction is to just say, like, I respect you and your experience. My second response is, might it be that what loving your husband or your ex-husband would be praying for his heart to change enough to regret how he treated you? Might that be what love is, right? Just like, God, I hope for one moment you can say, you know, I shouldn't have been a shit to my family. I shouldn't have been that person. Pardon my language. I'm just trying, right? But like, maybe that's what love is. And you know what? That may be out of reach too. And the last thing in the world I'm coming to do is judge you for that. But maybe that's something tradition is holding out, like, you know. And it was interesting because then she said to me, well, you know, he was beaten too as a kid. And what was so amazing was that even in that moment of hating him, she still articulated something that was deeply compassionate towards his own experience. I was like so moved by that. She couldn't even see that she was actually responding more compassionately than she understood. Anyway, I mean, I think it's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Which is, what'd you say?
I was just going to say, just expanding, like she was expanding for a moment, she was expanding the view, you know, she was seeing him in more dimensionality as a human being.
And also, I think moving beyond the idea that like loving someone else is some trite thing. Well, oh yeah, like I love him. I don't think that's what it means. I mean, I don't think Bruria thinks Rabbi Meir, her husband, right, is going to love those guys exactly,
right,
but he's going to open his heart enough to want something else for them.
And I'm thinking,
maybe that's the love that we can access. I don't know, or at least for a moment.
I also am thinking, and I'm looking at Judith's comment, which is something different. And of course, praying, not knowing you, that I don't represent or misrepresent or respond differently, respond wrongly. But it's making me think that, in some ways, having a consciousness of love is maybe like being aware of, okay, like looking around at the world and saying, toward this situation or these group of people, I am feeling love in this way. There is my family who I love in this fashion. There are these other people who I know, in this other way, and these other people I don't know. And then there are these people who are, who I hate, or are deserving of something different. And the card or whatever that I'm holding of them is maybe it's a question mark, or it's just an awareness of,
Right.
return later to dilemma of how to let, and just that's the best, not to, force into. And that's sort of my current clunky mechanistic formulation of how to sort of keep love as a lens, to go back to Kaya's thing. Maybe it's the whole set of things on the lens kit and there, but some of those love lenses, are yeah.
So maybe
Yeah,
maybe a nice way to close that loop, if you will, is that that's a deeper understanding of what I'm trying to get at when I talk about love as an umbrella term, right? When I say I love my kid, and when I say I love my neighbor, and when I say I love the person who abused me, I'm saying three very different things, very different emotionally, very different content-wise. What they have in common on some level is kind of wishing for the flourishing on some level of that person, but the flourishing of that person might involve repentance. So I feel like, John, your comment is actually, it's very profound, which is like, yeah, what love is filled with can be so different. Of course, to say I love my daughter and I love my neighbor and I love the person at work who mistreats me are not the same emotion. And certainly, and not even the same posture, but they're all sort of cousins. They're in the same family of postures. That's really the point in some profound way.
Yeah, I want to add also in this discussion that in the section in the Torah and Leviticus where it talks about loving your neighbor as yourself, right before it, it says, don't nurse hatred in your heart, or don't harbor it, don't nurse it. It doesn't say do not hate, but it's like, don't milk it. We're all human beings who are going to respond to injustice and violation and trauma with those feelings. That's part of being a human being. But the Torah doesn't say don't hate, period. But it does say don't milk it, don't nurse it, don't expand it, don't dwell on it in such a way that becomes the defining lens through which you are oriented to the world. So that's how I'm hearing that.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think when we talk about cultivating love, the idea of not cultivating hate is an important, correlate to that, or
and I think that's something that's more relatable. Like we all know that there are times when we've been offended or hurt that we can cultivate by going over and over and over again the event, right, in our heads, playing it again and again and again, and cultivating, the animosity toward another. And I think that is something that's workable, is to guard against the cultivation of hate.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. And a good note to end on, probably.
And someone just said, and it's Sharon, and maybe is the umbrella of love that gives us guardrails against milking hate. Yes, maybe it is the umbrella of love that gives us guardrails against milking hate. So, John, I think you wanted to say a few closing words to kind of wrap us up.
Very brief closing words. First of all, appreciation to Shai for being here, to Kaya and Robin, and to our three communities, and really for everyone in this, I assume mostly New Hampshire, but not entirely, who's come to join us here. We thought that this would be good for the beginning of the month of Elul, as a way to kind of orient ourselves toward we're all thinking about reflecting on the year, and we're thinking about tshuva, and a really important thing to try to put at the center, and that we hope this conversation will set the stage for carrying through. And if you haven't looked at the book, many of our shul libraries probably have it, or obviously go get a copy of the beautiful purple book that Kaya put up. I think that as part of a collective communal tshuva, I just want to read really one of my favorite passages in which Shai repeats some things that one of the many things I've loved that you've said over the years. And it's really a bit about our collective, especially our local collective. One of my main dreams for Jewish communities is really very simple. People should be able to look at any Jewish school, synagogue, community center, or Hillel, the way they already look at some, and say, that's a Jewish institution. It must be a bastion of love and goodness. It's simply amazing how much kindness they do. And certainly as a rabbi and communal leader, I'm thinking a lot about that as part of the collective tshuva mission for this time. And Kaya's opening was so beautiful. I think I'm going to just conclude with one line from our evening tefillah about love. We turn to the divine and we say, and your love do not move away from us ever. Baruch atah Adonai, who loves God's people Israel. V'yahavatcha al tasir mimenu li'olamim. Baruch atah Adonai, ohev Amo Yisrael.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Shai, for joining us
Thank you
tonight.
all. Thank you, Kaya and John. Thank you all.
And Robin as well.
And Robin, of course.
And to everyone who came tonight to participate and listen and learn and expand.